watched Jennifer's perfectly manicured fingers point toward the folding table in the corner, the one meant for the interns and summer assistants, and I knew this wasn't about seating arrangements anymore. "Mary Anne, we've set up a lovely spot for you over there," she said with that practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. 23 years I'd worked for Hartwell Associates. 23 years of perfect attendance and stellar reviews, and here I was being dismissed like a child who couldn't handle grown-up conversation. But what Jennifer didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been documenting everything. Every slight, every oversight, every casual cruelty they thought would go unnoticed. And tomorrow morning, I was going to hand it all over to the Maryland Department of Labor, along with copies of the emails they thought they'd deleted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Mary Anne Fitzgerald, and at 58 years old, I thought I'd seen every flavor of workplace politics Baltimore had to offer. I started at Hartwell Associates fresh out of community college in 2001, back when the company was small enough that everyone knew each other's birthdays, and we actually meant it when we asked about your weekend. The office was cramped then, squeezed into 3 floors of a converted brownstone in Federal Hill. But there was something honest about it. We were all working toward the same thing, building something together. I began as a data analyst, the kind of person who made sense of numbers that other people found boring. I loved the work, the way spreadsheets could tell stories if you knew how to read them properly. I was good at finding patterns, spotting inconsistencies, seeing the bigger picture that others missed. My supervisor back then, an older woman named Catherine, told me I had a gift for detail that couldn't be taught. She said I saw things others overlooked, and that would either make me invaluable or dangerous, depending on who was watching. Over the years, I watched Hartwell and Associates grow from that cozy brownstone into a gleaming glass tower in the Inner Harbor. We expanded from 12 employees to over 200. The company specialized in government contract consulting, helping federal agencies streamline their operations and reduce costs. It was steady work, important work, and I took pride in being part of something that mattered. I earned promotions slowly but consistently, moving from data analyst to senior analyst to project coordinator. I never asked for special treatment, never demanded attention. I just did the work, did it well, and trusted that competence would speak for itself. That trust began to crack about 3 years ago when Jennifer Walsh joined the company as Director of Operations. She arrived with an MBA from Georgetown, a wardrobe that cost more than my annual grocery budget, and a management philosophy that seemed to revolve around making herself indispensable by making everyone else feel replaceable. Jennifer was 34, blonde in that expensive way that required monthly maintenance, and she had a talent for making efficiency sound like innovation. She spoke in corporate buzzwords and treated every conversation like a performance review. From the beginning, Jennifer made it clear that she viewed the company's longer-term employees as dead weight. She never said it directly, of course. Instead, she would make comments about fresh perspectives and adapting to modern workflows. She instituted new policies almost weekly, each one designed to make our established routines feel outdated. She required approval for expenses that had been automatically processed for years. She implemented time-tracking software that monitored our computer activity. She scheduled mandatory workshops on productivity and collaboration, as if we hadn't been successfully productive and collaborative for decades. But her favorite tactic was exclusion. Jennifer had a way of scheduling important meetings during lunch breaks or after hours, times when she knew the older employees might have family obligations or simply needed a moment to breathe. She would send invitations for team-building events to carefully selected groups, always with a reason why certain people weren't included. She created inner circles and outer circles, and she made sure everyone knew which one they belonged to. I found myself increasingly relegated to the outer circle. My 20-plus years of experience became a liability rather than an asset. Jennifer would introduce me to clients as one of our legacy team members, a phrase that sounded respectful but felt like a gentle way of calling me obsolete. She began assigning my most interesting projects to younger analysts, explaining that they needed the experience to grow in their careers. My role slowly narrowed until I was primarily handling routine compliance reports and data entry, work that could have been done by someone half my age for half my salary. The real turning point came last spring during the quarterly review cycle. I had been working on a comprehensive analysis of cost overruns in our largest government contract, a project that had taken me months to complete. The report revealed systematic billing irregularities that were costing taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was exactly the kind of work I excelled at, the kind of detailed investigation that required both patience and expertise. I submitted the report through proper channels and waited for the follow-up meeting that never came. Instead, 2 weeks later, Jennifer presented my findings to the executive team as part of a broader efficiency initiative she was spearheading. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She stood at the front of the conference room with my charts and graphs projected behind her, explaining insights I had developed and conclusions I had drawn. She never mentioned my name. When I approached her afterward to ask about the presentation, she thanked me for my data support and suggested that going forward, all analytical work should be coordinated through her office to ensure consistency. That was when I realized that documentation wasn't just helpful anymore, it was essential. I began keeping copies of everything, not because I was planning some elaborate revenge, but because I needed to protect myself. I saved emails, printed reports, kept detailed notes of meetings and conversations. I created a paper trail that told the real story of what was happening at Hartwell Associates, a story that differed significantly from the narrative Jennifer was crafting for upper management. The more I documented, the more patterns I began to see. Jennifer wasn't just marginalizing older employees, she was systematically restructuring the company to benefit herself and her preferred colleagues. She was steering contracts toward vendors that offered her personal incentives. She was manipulating project timelines to make her initiatives appear more successful than they actually were. She was creating a culture of fear that discouraged dissent and rewarded loyalty to her specifically rather than to the company's mission. But perhaps most troubling was how she treated the company's annual holiday party, an event that had always been a celebration of our collective accomplishments. Under Jennifer's direction, it became a showcase for the new corporate hierarchy she was building. The party was held at the Baltimore Marriott, a venue far more expensive than our traditional celebrations, but Jennifer explained that it projected the right image for our growing company. The guest list was carefully curated, the seating arrangements strategically planned, and every detail was designed to reinforce who mattered and who didn't. I should have seen it coming when the invitation arrived with a dress code that seemed designed to exclude anyone who couldn't afford designer attire. The theme was celebrating excellence, and Jennifer made it clear that attendance was not technically mandatory, but strongly encouraged for anyone who wanted to demonstrate their commitment to the company's future. The language was careful, professional, but the message was unmistakable. Show up and play along, or be marked as someone who wasn't fully invested in the team. The night of the party, I arrived wearing my best dress, a navy blue outfit I had worn to my daughter's wedding. 3 years earlier, it wasn't fashionable, but it was appropriate, or so I thought. The ballroom was decorated with the company colors, burgundy and gold, and round tables were arranged throughout the space. Each table had a small placard with the names of assigned guests, and I walked among them looking for mine. I found my name at a small rectangular table near the service entrance, the kind of table typically used for overflow seating or vendor representatives. Sitting with me were 3 interns from the summer program, a new hire who had started the previous week, and 2 employees from the mailroom. Jennifer had literally created a kids' table, and she had put me at it. The symbolism was not subtle. While the senior staff sat at large round tables near the stage, engaging in conversation with clients and executives, I was relegated to a corner with people who were either too young or too new to understand what was happening. The interns were polite but clearly uncomfortable, unsure why they were seated with someone who had been with the company longer than they had been alive. The new hire kept checking her phone, probably wondering if she had made a mistake accepting the job. The mailroom workers seemed resigned to their fate, accustomed to being treated as invisible. I sat down without making a scene. I smiled at my table mates and made small talk about the venue and the food. I listened to Jennifer's speech about innovation and excellence, and I applauded at the appropriate moments. But inside, something was crystallizing. This wasn't just about seating arrangements or corporate politics anymore. This was about respect, about recognition, about the value of experience and dedication. This was about what happens when competence is overshadowed by charisma, when substance loses to style. During the cocktail hour, I excused myself and walked to the ladies' room. I needed a moment to collect my thoughts, to process what had just happened and decide how to respond. The bathroom was empty except for one other woman, someone I didn't recognize from the company. She was older, probably in her 60s, wearing an elegant black dress and touching up her lipstick in the mirror. "You work for Hartwell?" she asked, noticing my name tag. 23 years, I replied. She nodded thoughtfully. "I'm Patricia Brennan. I'm with the Department of Labor. We're conducting some routine compliance reviews of government contractors. Your company came up in our rotation." The conversation was brief, polite, perfectly innocent. But as she handed me her business card, she mentioned that her office was always interested in hearing from employees who had concerns about workplace practices or contract compliance. She said it quietly, casually, as if she were commenting on the weather. I tucked the card into my purse and returned to the party. I spent the rest of the evening observing, listening, taking mental notes of conversations and interactions. Watched Jennifer work the room, moving from table to table with practiced grace, making sure to spend extra time with the clients and executives while barely acknowledging the employees who actually did the work. I watched Robert, our CEO, nod approvingly at everything she said, clearly impressed by her performance. I watched the other senior staff members compete for her attention, eager to be included in whatever inner circle she was forming. But I also watched the people at my table and tables like it. I saw the resignation in their faces, the way they had accepted their place in Jennifer's hierarchy. I saw talent being wasted, experience being dismissed, dedication being taken for granted. And I realized that if I didn't do something, if I didn't use what I knew and what I had documented, nothing would change. The company would continue down this path until all the institutional knowledge walked out the door, taking decades of experience with it. That night, I went home to my small row house in Fells Point and spread my documentation across the dining room table. I had emails showing Jennifer steering contracts to preferred vendors. I had reports demonstrating how she manipulated project metrics to make her initiatives appear more successful. I had records of meetings where she made decisions that directly violated company policies and federal regulations. I had a pattern of behavior that painted a clear picture of someone who was more interested in building her own empire than serving the company's mission. But more than that, I had something Jennifer didn't know I possessed: a complete record of the irregularities I had discovered in our largest government contract, the analysis she had claimed credit for without understanding its full implications. The billing problems I had identified were not just administrative errors. They were systematic violations of federal contracting laws, and if the Department of Labor wanted to conduct a compliance review, I had everything they would need to see exactly how deep the problems went. I spent the weekend organizing my evidence, creating a comprehensive file that told the story chronologically. I included copies of emails, printed reports, meeting notes, and financial records. I cross-referenced everything with relevant company policies and federal regulations. I built a case that was methodical, thorough, and absolutely damning. On Monday morning, I called Patricia Brennan's office and scheduled a meeting. I didn't tell anyone at work what I was doing. I simply requested a personal day and drove to the federal building downtown. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Patricia listened carefully as I walked through my documentation, asking detailed questions and taking extensive notes. She was particularly interested in the contract billing irregularities and the vendor relationships Jennifer had cultivated. At the end of the meeting, Patricia thanked me for my thoroughness and professionalism. She explained that the Department of Labor would be conducting a formal investigation and that the company would be notified within the week. She assured me that my identity as a whistleblower would be protected under federal law, but she also warned me that workplace retaliation was always a possibility despite legal protections. I returned to work that afternoon feeling lighter than I had in months. I had done what needed to be done, and now it was out of my hands. I continued my routine as if nothing had changed, completing my assigned tasks and attending my scheduled meetings. Jennifer was her usual self, confident and commanding, completely unaware that her carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. The investigation began quietly. Federal auditors arrived the following Thursday, explaining to senior management that they were conducting a routine compliance review of the company's government contracts. They requested access to financial records, vendor agreements, and project documentation. They scheduled interviews with key personnel, including Jennifer, Robert, and several other senior staff members. What Jennifer didn't realize was that the auditors already knew exactly what they were looking for. My documentation had provided them with a roadmap to the problems, allowing them to focus their investigation on the most serious violations. They didn't need to waste time searching for irregularities. They could go directly to the evidence of systematic misconduct. The interviews began the following week. I was called in on Tuesday morning, and I answered their questions honestly and completely. I provided additional context for the documents I had submitted and explained the patterns of behavior I had observed. The auditors were professional and thorough, clearly taking the investigation seriously. Jennifer's interview was scheduled for Wednesday afternoon. I watched from my desk as she prepared, gathering files and consulting with the company's legal counsel. She seemed confident, even eager to demonstrate her competence to federal investigators. She had no idea that they already had evidence of her misconduct, that every answer she gave would be measured against a comprehensive record of her actual behavior. The investigation continued for 2 weeks. Auditors reviewed thousands of documents, interviewed dozens of employees, and analyzed financial records going back 3 years. The atmosphere in the office grew increasingly tense as word spread about the scope and seriousness of the review. Jennifer tried to maintain her usual commanding presence, but there was something different in her demeanor, a subtle uncertainty that hadn't been there before. The results came on a Friday afternoon in late November. Robert called an emergency all-hands meeting for 4 o'clock. The entire company gathered in the main conference room, squeezing in around tables and standing. Along the walls, the mood was somber, anxious, as if everyone sensed that something significant was about to happen. Robert stood at the front of the room looking older than I had ever seen him. He explained that the Department of Labor had completed their investigation and found serious violations of federal contracting regulations. The company was facing substantial fines and the potential loss of several major contracts. More importantly, the investigators had identified specific individuals whose actions had contributed to the violations. Jennifer's termination was effective immediately. So was that of 2 other senior managers who had been complicit in her schemes. The company would be implementing new compliance procedures and oversight mechanisms to prevent future violations. Several pending contracts would need to be renegotiated or canceled entirely. The financial impact would be significant, potentially requiring layoffs and restructuring. As Robert spoke, I watched Jennifer's face transform from confusion to shock to devastating realization. She understood now that this wasn't a routine compliance issue that could be managed with proper spin and careful explanations. This was the systematic unraveling of everything she had built, every shortcut she had taken, every corner she had cut, finally catching up with her. The meeting ended in stunned silence. People filed out slowly, whispering among themselves, trying to process what had just happened. Jennifer gathered her personal belongings and left the building within an hour, escorted by security as required by company policy. She didn't say goodbye to anyone, didn't offer explanations or apologies. She simply vanished, as if she had never been there at all. The weeks that followed were difficult for everyone. The company struggled to manage the fallout from the investigation, working to repair relationships with clients and rebuild trust with federal agencies. Several promising projects were canceled, and a number of employees were laid off as the company tried to stabilize its finances. The atmosphere was subdued, uncertain as everyone wondered whether Hartwell Associates would survive the scandal. But gradually, something positive began to emerge from the chaos. With Jennifer gone, the artificial hierarchy she had created began to dissolve. Experienced employees who had been marginalized found themselves back in meaningful roles. Project. Decisions were made based on expertise rather than politics. The company's focus shifted back to the work itself rather than internal power struggles. I was asked to lead the effort to rebuild the compliance program, drawing on my analytical skills and institutional knowledge to create systems that would prevent future violations. It was challenging work, requiring me to examine every aspect of the company's operations and recommend changes that would satisfy federal requirements while maintaining operational efficiency. For the first time in years, I felt like my experience was not just valued but essential. The annual holiday party that December was a much smaller affair, held in the office conference room rather than an expensive hotel ballroom. There were no assigned seats, no carefully orchestrated networking opportunities, no performance of corporate success. Just colleagues sharing food and conversation, celebrating the fact that we had survived a difficult year and were still working together. I sat wherever I wanted that night, at a table with people who had become friends rather than just coworkers. We talked about our families, our hobbies, our hopes for the coming year. We laughed about office inside jokes and shared stories about the early days when the company was young and scrappy. It felt like the Hartwell Associates I had joined 23 years earlier, the place where competence mattered more than charisma, and where everyone's contribution was recognized and valued. As I drove home that night through the quiet streets of Baltimore, I reflected on everything that had happened. I had spent months feeling invisible, dismissed, relegated to the margins of a company I had helped build. But I had also learned something important about power and patience, about the difference between making noise and making change. Sometimes the most effective response to injustice isn't confrontation, but documentation. Sometimes the best revenge is simply telling the truth and letting the consequences unfold naturally. Jennifer had made me sit at the kids' table, treating me like someone whose opinions didn't matter and whose experience was irrelevant. But that treatment had also freed me to observe without being watched, to document without being suspected, to build a case without anyone realizing what I was doing. Her dismissal of me had been both an insult and an opportunity, and I had chosen to make the most of both. The investigation was over, the violations had been addressed, and the company was rebuilding on a stronger foundation. Justice had been served not through dramatic confrontation, but through careful preparation and professional documentation. And I had learned that sometimes the person sitting at the kids' table has been paying closer attention than anyone realized. The weeks following the holiday party settled into an uncomfortable rhythm that felt like waiting for a storm that everyone could sense, but no one wanted to acknowledge. Jennifer returned to the office after the New Year break with renewed energy, as if the humiliation of seating arrangements had somehow fueled her ambition rather than dampened it. She moved through the hallways with a different kind of purpose now, her clipboard clutched tighter, her meetings running longer, her smile sharper when she addressed those of us she considered expendable. I noticed the change immediately because I had become an expert at reading the subtle shifts in office dynamics. When you spend 2 decades in the same workplace, you develop an almost supernatural awareness of atmospheric pressure, the way sailors can sense a hurricane brewing long before the first clouds appear on the horizon. Jennifer's new intensity felt dangerous, like electricity building in the air before lightning strikes. The first sign of escalation came during our monthly department meeting in January. These gatherings had traditionally been informal affairs where we discussed ongoing projects, shared updates, and addressed any concerns that had arisen. Under the previous management structure, everyone was encouraged to contribute, and the IIT conversations often meandered in productive directions that led to genuine problem-solving. But Jennifer had transformed these meetings into something closer to military briefings, with predetermined agendas and little tolerance for discussion that didn't serve her immediate objectives. That particular Tuesday morning, the conference room felt smaller than usual despite being the same space we had always used. Jennifer had rearranged the furniture so that she stood at the head of a long rectangular table, while the rest of us sat in rows facing her, like students in a classroom, waiting to be called upon. The symbolism was not accidental. She had positioned herself as the authority figure while reducing the rest of us to passive recipients of information rather than collaborative colleagues. She began the meeting by announcing a new efficiency initiative that would require all project proposals to be submitted through a centralized system that she would personally oversee. The change was presented as a way to ensure consistency and eliminate redundancy, but I recognized it for what it actually was: a mechanism for controlling information flow and consolidating power. Under this new system, Jennifer would become the gatekeeper for all significant work, with the authority to approve or reject projects based on criteria that remained conveniently undefined. When Susan Martinez, one of our senior project managers, asked for clarification about the approval process, Jennifer responded with a practiced patience that felt more condescending than helpful. She explained that the new system would allow management to better align individual projects with overall strategic objectives, as if the rest of us had been working without any sense of purpose or direction for the past 20 years. She used phrases like optimization and streamlining and best practices, corporate buzzwords that sounded impressive but actually meant very little. But it was during the discussion of personnel assignments that Jennifer revealed the true scope of her intentions. She announced that several long-term employees would be transitioning to new roles that would better utilize their skills and experience. The language was diplomatic, but the implications were clear. She was systematically removing experienced workers from positions of responsibility and replacing them with younger, less expensive alternatives who would be more likely to follow her direction without question. My own reassignment was presented as an opportunity for professional development. Jennifer explained that my analytical skills would be better served in a support role that would allow me to focus on data management and compliance reporting rather than the more complex investigative work I had been doing. She made it sound like a promotion, an acknowledgement of my unique talents, but I understood that I was being demoted to clerical work that any recent college graduate could handle. The meeting continued for another hour, with Jennifer outlining additional changes that would fundamentally alter the way our department operated. She introduced new reporting requirements that would consume hours of administrative time. She mandated training sessions on topics that most of us already understood, better than the instructors she planned to bring in. She implemented review processes that would slow down project completion while creating multiple opportunities for her to insert herself into every decision. As I sat in that conference room listening to Jennifer systematically dismantle the collaborative culture that had made Hartwell Associates successful, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was certainly frustration involved. It was more like the quiet determination that comes when you realize that polite cooperation is no longer sufficient to address a problem that continues to grow worse. After the meeting, I returned to my desk and opened a new folder on my computer. I labeled it documentation and began keeping detailed records of every policy change, every personnel decision, every meeting where Jennifer revealed more of her true intentions. I wasn't planning anything specific at that point. I was simply following an instinct that told me information would eventually become important, and I wanted to be prepared when that moment arrived. The changes Jennifer had announced during the meeting were implemented with remarkable speed, as if she had been planning them for months and was finally ready to execute her vision. Within 2 weeks, the new project approval system was operational, and several experienced employees had been moved to different positions. The efficiency of the transition suggested a level of preparation that made me wonder how long Jennifer had been working toward this moment. My own transition to the new support role happened gradually, which made it feel less like a demotion and more like a slow erosion of responsibility. Projects I had been leading were reassigned to junior analysts who lacked the experience to handle the complexity involved. Clients who had specifically requested my involvement were told that I was no longer available for that type of work. Meetings that I had previously attended as a key participant suddenly occurred without my knowledge, and I would only learn about important decisions after they had already been made. The most frustrating aspect of this process was how reasonable Jennifer made everything sound when questioned. She had an explanation for every change, a justification for every decision that sounded logical when considered in isolation. It was only when you looked at the pattern of changes that the true purpose became clear. She was systematically removing anyone who might challenge her authority or possess institutional knowledge that could threaten her control. But Jennifer's most effective tactic was not the obvious power plays or the formal reorganization. It was the subtle campaign of isolation she waged against anyone she perceived as a potential threat. She had a gift for making exclusion feel accidental, for creating situations where certain people naturally found themselves on the outside of important conversations and decision-making processes. The technique was remarkably sophisticated. Jennifer would schedule impromptu meetings with carefully selected participants, explaining later that she hadn't wanted to burden everyone with routine discussions. She would send emails to distribution, lists that somehow failed to include specific individuals, then express surprise when those people claimed they hadn't received important information. She would organize team-building activities and training sessions with limited capacity, ensuring that the same people were consistently left out due to scheduling conflicts or space limitations. I found myself increasingly excluded from these informal networks of communication and collaboration. Conversations would stop when I approached groups of colleagues, not because anyone was deliberately trying to shut me out, but because the topics being discussed were no longer considered relevant to my role. Invitations to lunch meetings became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Email chains that had once included me automatically began bypassing my inbox, leaving me to discover important developments through second-hand reports or casual mentions in hallway conversations. The isolation was not dramatic enough to file a formal complaint about, but it was comprehensive enough to effectively marginalize anyone who experienced it. Jennifer had created a system where exclusion felt natural rather than intentional, where being left out seemed like a logical consequence of organizational efficiency rather than a deliberate strategy to diminish influence and access. By March, I realized that my situation at Hartwell Associates had fundamentally changed. I was still employed, still receiving my salary, still showing up every day to complete the tasks assigned to me, but I was no longer truly part of the organization in any meaningful way. I had become a legacy employee whose presence was tolerated rather than valued, whose contributions were acknowledged but not utilized, whose experience was treated as an unfortunate reminder of outdated approaches, rather than a valuable resource. The realization might have been devastating if it hadn't also been clarifying. For months, I had been trying to understand why I felt increasingly uncomfortable at work, why simple interactions had become strained, why projects that should have been straightforward had become unnecessarily complicated. Now I understood that these were not random difficulties or temporary adjustments to new management. They were the predictable results of a deliberate strategy designed to push me toward resignation. Jennifer wanted me to quit. She wanted all of the experienced employees to quit, eliminating the need for formal layoffs while clearing the way for her to rebuild the department according to her vision. The efficiency initiatives and reorganization efforts were not actually intended to improve performance. They were designed to make work so frustrating and unrewarding for certain employees that leaving would seem like the most reasonable option. But understanding Jennifer's strategy also revealed its weakness. She was operating under the assumption that experienced employees like me were too set in our ways to adapt, too attached to old methods to embrace change, too proud to accept diminished roles. She believed that we would eventually become so frustrated with our reduced circumstances that we would voluntarily remove ourselves from the equation. What Jennifer didn't understand was that some of us had developed patience over the course of our careers. We had survived previous reorganizations, weathered other difficult managers, adapted to countless policy changes and strategic shifts. We knew that workplace dynamics were temporary, that even the most entrenched power structures eventually changed, and that sometimes the best response to immediate pressure was strategic endurance rather than immediate reaction. I decided to wait, not passively, not with resignation, but with the kind of active patience that comes from understanding that information is power, and that time often reveals opportunities that are not immediately apparent. I would continue documenting everything, continue observing the patterns, continue building a comprehensive record of what was actually happening at Hartwell Associates versus what was being officially reported. The decision to wait rather than react immediately was not easy. There were moments when I wanted to confront Jennifer directly, to challenge her decisions in public forums, to force conversations about fairness and respect that might have provided temporary satisfaction. But I had learned over the years that confrontation often serves the interests of people who thrive on conflict more than it serves the interests of people who simply want to do good work in a reasonable environment. Instead, I focused on doing my assigned tasks with the same level of competence I had always brought to my work, regardless of how menial or routine those tasks had become. I maintained professional relationships with colleagues, even when those relationships were strained by the new organizational dynamics. I participated in training sessions and meetings with appropriate engagement, neither withdrawing completely, nor challenging the new systems in ways that would make me an obvious target for retaliation. But I also began paying closer attention to details that might have seemed insignificant under normal circumstances. I noticed which vendors were being selected for new contracts and researched their connections to company leadership. I tracked the approval process for projects and identified patterns in what was being approved versus what was being rejected. I monitored email communications and meeting schedules to understand how information was flowing through the organization and who was being included in which conversations. Most importantly, I began documenting the financial implications of Jennifer's management decisions. As someone with extensive experience in data analysis and cost tracking, I could see trends that might not be immediately obvious to casual observers. The efficiency initiatives that Jennifer was implementing were actually increasing costs in several areas while creating bottlenecks that slowed project completion. The personnel changes were eliminating institutional knowledge that would be expensive to replace. The new approval processes were creating delays that were affecting client satisfaction and potentially jeopardizing contract renewals. I compiled this information methodically, creating spreadsheets and reports that tracked the measurable impact of policy changes over time. I was not looking for minor irregularities or technical violations that could be explained away. I was building a comprehensive picture of systemic problems that were affecting the company's performance and potentially its long-term viability. The work was painstaking and often tedious, requiring me to cross-reference multiple data sources and verify information through various channels. But it was also familiar work, the kind of detailed analysis that I had been doing successfully for over 2 decades. I knew how to identify significant patterns in large data sets. I knew how to present complex information in clear, understandable formats. I knew how to build compelling cases based on objective evidence rather than subjective. Complaints. By late spring, I had accumulated a substantial body of documentation that told a troubling story about the direction Hartwell Associates was heading under Jennifer's leadership. The company was becoming less efficient rather than more efficient, less competitive rather than more competitive, less stable rather than more stable. The changes that were being implemented in the name of modernization and optimization were actually undermining the fundamental strengths that had made the company successful. But I also knew that having documentation was not the same as having an opportunity to present it effectively. Jennifer controlled most of the formal communication channels within the company, and she was unlikely to provide a platform for information that contradicted her narrative of progress and improvement. I needed to find the right moment and the right audience for the evidence I had gathered, and I needed to be patient enough to wait for that opportunity to arise naturally. The opportunity began to take shape in June when I received an unexpected phone call at my desk. The caller identified herself as Patricia Chen from the Maryland Department of Labor Relations, and she explained that her office was conducting a routine review of workplace safety and compliance practices at several government contractors in the Baltimore area. Hartwell Associates had been selected for review based on our contract portfolio and recent growth patterns. The conversation was brief and professional. Patricia explained that the review would involve examining personnel policies, safety, procedures, and compliance documentation to ensure that the company was meeting all applicable federal and state requirements. She said that initial interviews would be conducted with management personnel, but that employees at all levels might be contacted for additional information as the review progressed. After the call ended, I sat at my desk for several minutes, processing what I had just heard. A routine compliance review was exactly the kind of external scrutiny that could provide an appropriate context for the information I had been documenting. Government investigators would have the authority to examine company records, interview employees confidentially, and evaluate whether policies were being implemented in ways that served legitimate business purposes rather than personal agendas. I did not immediately contact Patricia Chen or volunteer information about my concerns. That would have been premature and potentially counterproductive. Instead, I continued my routine documentation while monitoring how the company prepared for the upcoming review. I wanted to see how Jennifer would respond to external oversight, whether she would attempt to control the narrative or allow investigators to examine the evidence objectively. Jennifer's response to news of the compliance review was revealing, in ways that confirmed many of my suspicions about her management approach. Rather than treating the review as a routine business matter, she immediately went into crisis management mode, organizing preparation sessions and briefing materials, as if the company were facing a hostile audit rather than standard regulatory oversight. She scheduled multiple meetings with senior staff to coordinate responses to potential questions. She commissioned a comprehensive review of all personnel files to ensure that documentation met current standards. She retained an external consulting firm to conduct a preliminary assessment and identify any areas of potential concern before the official review began. Most tellingly, Jennifer began reaching out to individual employees to discuss their experiences at the company and ensure that everyone understood the importance of presenting a unified, positive message to the investigators. These conversations were framed as informal check-ins, but they felt more like coaching sessions designed to shape testimony rather than gather honest feedback. When Jennifer scheduled a meeting with me, I approached it with careful neutrality. I listened to her talking points about the company's commitment to employee satisfaction and professional development. I nodded appropriately when she emphasized the importance of accuracy and consistency in any discussions with outside investigators. I assured her that I would be honest and professional in any interactions with the review team. But I also paid close attention to the specific topics Jennifer seemed most concerned about. She was particularly interested in whether employees felt that personnel decisions were being made fairly and whether anyone had concerns about discrimination or retaliation. She wanted to know if there were any workplace issues that might be misinterpreted by investigators who were unfamiliar with the company's culture and operational requirements. The subtext of these questions was clear. Jennifer was worried that disgruntled employees might present a skewed picture of the company's practices to investigators who would not understand the context or rationale behind recent changes. She wanted to ensure that any concerns were addressed internally rather than being raised during the formal review process. After my meeting with Jennifer, I understood that the compliance review represented exactly the opportunity I had been waiting for. An objective third party would be evaluating the company's practices and policies, and they would have the authority to access information and interview employees without interference from management. If I had evidence of problematic patterns in decision-making or policy implementation, this would be the appropriate forum for presenting that evidence. I spent the weekend organizing my documentation into a comprehensive file that told a clear, chronological story about the changes that had occurred at Hartwell Associates over the past year. I included specific examples of policy decisions that had decreased efficiency, personnel changes that had eliminated institutional knowledge, and cost increases that had resulted from supposedly money-saving initiatives. Most importantly, I documented the pattern of exclusion and marginalization that had affected multiple experienced employees, showing how these tactics were being used to encourage voluntary departures rather than acknowledging the value of long-term workers. I presented the information objectively, focusing on measurable impacts rather than personal grievances, building a case based on evidence rather than emotion. On Monday morning, I called Patricia Chen's office and requested a confidential meeting to discuss information that might be relevant to the compliance review. I explained that I had been with the company for over 20 years and had observed patterns that might warrant investigation. Patricia scheduled a meeting for the following week at a location away from the company offices. As I prepared for that meeting, I reflected on how the situation had evolved from a series of minor frustrations to a systematic documentation project to a formal complaint with potential legal implications. I had not sought this confrontation, had not wanted to become a whistleblower or an adversary to my employer. But Jennifer's escalating campaign to marginalize experienced employees had created a situation where silence was no longer a viable option. The compliance review was beginning, and I was ready to present evidence that would allow investigators to see past Jennifer's carefully constructed narrative and understand what was actually happening at Hartwell Associates. The truth was about to have its day in court, and I had spent months preparing to make sure it would be heard clearly and completely. The meeting with Patricia Chen took place on a Thursday morning at a small coffee shop in downtown Baltimore, far enough from the Hartwell Associates office building to ensure privacy, but close enough to the federal courthouse to feel appropriately official. I arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table where we could speak without being overheard, and ordered a simple black coffee that I barely touched while waiting for Patricia to arrive. When she walked through the door, I recognized her immediately from her confident posture and the way she scanned the room before approaching my table. Patricia was probably in her early 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she had conducted hundreds of these conversations over the course of her career. She shook my hand, firmly ordered her own coffee, and settled into the chair across from me with a small recording device and a legal pad. The conversation began with standard questions about my employment history and my role at the company. Patricia asked about my responsibilities, my reporting structure, and my general impressions of the workplace culture. I answered these preliminary questions honestly but carefully, providing factual information without immediately launching into my concerns. I wanted to establish my credibility as a reliable witness before presenting more serious allegations. As the conversation progressed, Patricia's questions became more specific. She asked about recent changes in management practices, personnel policies, and organizational structure. She wanted to know about employee turnover, training programs, and communication between different levels of the company hierarchy. Her questions were professional and pointed, suggesting that she already had some familiarity with issues that might exist at companies like ours. When Patricia asked if I had observed any practices that might violate federal employment regulations or contract compliance requirements, I knew it was time to present the documentation I had prepared. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a carefully organized folder containing copies of emails, policy memos, financial reports, and personnel records that I had compiled over the previous months. I explained to Patricia that I had been documenting patterns of behavior that seemed designed to circumvent normal employment practices while avoiding obvious legal violations. I showed her examples of how experienced employees were being systematically excluded from meaningful work assignments, how decision-making processes had been restructured to eliminate input from workers with institutional knowledge, and how efficiency initiatives were actually increasing costs while reducing productivity. The evidence I presented was substantial and well-organized. I had created timeline charts showing how personnel changes had accelerated after Jennifer's arrival. I had compiled cost analysis reports demonstrating how her management decisions were affecting the company's financial performance. I had documented communication patterns that revealed how information was being controlled and manipulated to support predetermined conclusions rather than facilitate informed decision-making. But the most compelling evidence involved the systematic violations of federal contracting regulations that I had discovered through my routine data analysis work. Over the course of several months, I had identified billing irregularities, vendor selection practices, and project management decisions that appeared to violate the strict compliance requirements that governed government contracts. These were not minor administrative errors or debatable interpretations of complex regulations. They were clear, documented violations that could result in significant penalties and the loss of federal contracts. Patricia examined each piece of evidence carefully, asking detailed questions about dates, sources, and verification procedures. She was particularly interested in the financial documentation, requesting additional information about contract terms, billing cycles, and approval processes. Her questions were technical and precise, indicating that she understood both the regulatory framework and the specific ways that violations typically occurred in government contracting environments. The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours, with Patricia taking extensive notes and requesting copies of key documents for her official file. She explained that the Department of Labor would be conducting a comprehensive investigation based on the information I had provided, and that additional interviews would be scheduled with other employees and company officials. She assured me that my identity as the source of the initial complaint would be protected under federal whistleblower statutes, but she also warned me that workplace retaliation was always a possibility despite legal protections. As our meeting concluded, Patricia thanked me for my thoroughness and professionalism. She explained that cases involving systematic violations of employment and contracting regulations often took months to resolve, but that the evidence I had provided gave investigators a clear roadmap for their inquiry. She handed me her business card and encouraged me to contact her immediately if I experienced any form of retaliation or if I discovered additional evidence of violations. Driving back to the office after the meeting, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension that was difficult to describe. I had finally taken action after months of careful documentation and strategic patience, but I also understood that I had crossed a threshold that would fundamentally change my relationship with my employer. Regardless of how the investigation concluded, I could never again be just another employee trying to do good work in a challenging environment. I had become a whistleblower, with all the protections and vulnerabilities that status entailed. The immediate challenge was returning to my normal routine without revealing that anything had changed. I needed to continue performing my assigned duties competently while avoiding any behavior that might suggest I was involved in external communications about company practices. This required a delicate balance between maintaining professional normalcy and staying alert to developments that might affect the investigation or my personal safety within the organization. Over the following weeks, I observed subtle changes in the office atmosphere that suggested management was becoming aware of increased external scrutiny. Jennifer seemed more guarded in her communications, often requesting face-to-face meetings, instead of sending emails about sensitive topics. Senior staff members were spending more time in closed-door conferences, and there was a general sense of heightened attention to documentation and procedure compliance. The official notification of the Department of Labor investigation arrived on a Monday morning in early July. Robert, our company president, called an emergency meeting for all senior staff and department heads to announce that federal investigators would be conducting a comprehensive review of employment practices and contract compliance procedures. He emphasized that this was a routine matter that all government contractors faced periodically, and that everyone should cooperate fully while continuing to focus on their normal responsibilities. Jennifer's response to the investigation announcement was particularly revealing. Rather than treating it as a routine business matter, she immediately began implementing damage control measures that suggested she understood the seriousness of the situation. She scheduled individual meetings with key employees to review their understanding of company policies and procedures. She commissioned an internal audit of all personnel files and contract documentation. She retained an external law firm to provide legal guidance throughout the investigation process. Most significantly, Jennifer began reaching out to employees who might have grievances or concerns about recent management decisions. These conversations were presented as opportunities for open dialogue and problem-solving, but they felt more like intelligence-gathering missions designed to identify potential sources of damaging information. She was clearly trying to assess the scope of any internal complaints while positioning herself as a reasonable manager who was willing to address legitimate concerns through appropriate channels. When Jennifer scheduled a meeting with me, I approached it with careful preparation and strategic thinking. I understood that she was likely trying to determine whether I was a source of information for the investigation, and I needed to navigate the conversation without revealing my involvement while also avoiding any statements that could be used against me later. The meeting was scheduled for late afternoon on a Friday, suggesting that Jennifer wanted to have a private conversation without interruption from normal business activities. Jennifer began the meeting by expressing appreciation for my long service to the company and my consistent professionalism during a period of significant organizational change. She acknowledged that recent management decisions had affected everyone's responsibilities and work assignments, and she wanted to ensure that I felt comfortable with my current role and future prospects within the organization. The conversation proceeded through a series of carefully worded questions about my job satisfaction, my relationships with colleagues, and my understanding of recent policy changes. Jennifer was fishing for information about my attitude toward management and my willingness to support the company during external scrutiny. She wanted to know if I had any concerns that needed to be addressed or any suggestions for improving workplace communication and efficiency. I responded to these questions with appropriate professionalism, acknowledging that periods of change were always challenging while expressing confidence in the company's long-term success. I avoided making any statements that could be interpreted as complaints or criticisms, while also refraining from enthusiastic endorsements that would seem disingenuous. I maintained a neutral, cooperative tone that provided no useful information for Jennifer's purposes. But the most revealing aspect of the meeting was Jennifer's emphasis on the importance of presenting a unified, positive image to external investigators. She stressed that outside observers might misinterpret normal business decisions or temporary adjustments as more serious problems if they lacked proper context and understanding. She encouraged me to be honest in any conversations with investigators, while also being mindful of how my responses might affect the company's reputation and future prospects. The subtext of this guidance was unmistakable. Jennifer was asking me to minimize or rationalize any concerns I might have about management practices, to present company policies in the most favorable light possible, and to avoid providing information that could be used to support allegations of wrongdoing. She was not explicitly asking me to lie or withhold information, but she was clearly hoping to influence my testimony through appeals to company loyalty and team solidarity. After the meeting concluded, I understood that Jennifer suspected I might be a source of damaging information for the investigation. Her careful questioning and emphasis on loyalty suggested that she was concerned about my potential cooperation with external investigators. This suspicion created additional risks for me, but it also confirmed that my documentation and complaint were being taken seriously by company leadership. Over the following weeks, I observed Jennifer implementing a comprehensive strategy to control information and manage the investigation process. She established new protocols for document retention and employee communications. She assigned trusted allies to monitor workplace conversations and report any discussions about the investigation. She began scheduling more frequent one-on-one meetings with employees who might have access to sensitive information or grievances against management. These tactics created an atmosphere of surveillance and suspicion that made normal workplace interactions increasingly uncomfortable. Colleagues became more guarded in their conversations, uncertain about who might be reporting their comments to management. Email communications became more formal and circumspect, with important discussions moving to private phone calls or face-to-face meetings. The open, collaborative culture that had once characterized Hartwell Associates was being replaced by an environment of mutual distrust and defensive behavior. But Jennifer's control measures also revealed the extent of her concerns about the investigation. Her willingness to implement such disruptive changes suggested that she understood the seriousness of the allegations being investigated and the potential consequences if violations were confirmed. She was not behaving like someone who was confident that a routine review would vindicate her management practices. She was behaving like someone who was trying to prevent damaging information from reaching investigators. The investigation itself proceeded methodically over the course of several weeks. Federal investigators interviewed employees at all levels of the organization, reviewed thousands of documents, and analyzed financial records dating back several years. The process was thorough and professional, with investigators maintaining strict confidentiality about their findings while gathering evidence from multiple sources. I was interviewed twice during the investigation, once as part of the general employee survey, and once as a follow-up to specific issues that had been identified through document review. Both interviews were conducted at the federal building, downtown, away from company premises, ensuring that my participation could not be observed by management or colleagues. During these interviews, I provided detailed information about the patterns of behavior I had documented, the financial irregularities I had discovered, and the systematic exclusion of experienced employees from meaningful work assignments. I answered all questions honestly and completely, providing additional context and supporting evidence when requested. The investigators were professional and thorough, clearly taking the allegations seriously while maintaining appropriate objectivity about their findings. Between the interviews, I continued my normal work routine while carefully observing developments within the company. I noticed that certain employees who had been interviewed seemed more nervous and withdrawn afterward, suggesting that they had provided information that might not support management's preferred narrative. I also observed that Jennifer was spending increasing amounts of time in meetings with the external legal counsel, indicating that the investigation was revealing issues that required professional legal guidance. The most significant development occurred in late August when investigators requested access to financial records and contract documentation that Jennifer had not voluntarily provided during the initial document review. This escalation suggested that the investigation had moved beyond routine compliance checking to focus on specific allegations of regulatory violations. The request for additional documents indicated that investigators had found evidence supporting the concerns I had raised about billing irregularities and vendor selection practices. Jennifer's response to this escalation was to implement even more restrictive information control measures. She required all employee communications with external parties to be approved in advance by management. She established new protocols, for document access and copying that made it virtually impossible for employees to remove company information from the premises. She began conducting surprise audits of employee computer files and email accounts, ostensibly to ensure compliance with data security policies. These measures created an increasingly hostile work environment that made it clear Jennifer viewed her own employees as potential threats rather than trusted colleagues. The surveillance and control tactics she implemented were more appropriate for a workplace where espionage was suspected than for a normal business operation facing routine regulatory review. Her behavior suggested that she was more concerned about preventing additional evidence from reaching investigators than about actually addressing the underlying problems that had prompted the investigation. But Jennifer's defensive measures also provided additional evidence of the systematic management problems that had motivated my original complaint. Her willingness to treat employees as adversaries, to restrict normal business communications, and to implement surveillance measures demonstrated exactly the kind of authoritarian management style that had been marginalizing experienced workers and undermining workplace culture. By early September, it became clear that the investigation was nearing completion. Investigators had gathered extensive evidence, interviewed numerous witnesses, and analyzed financial records in detail. The atmosphere in the office was tense and expectant, with everyone understanding that significant findings would be announced soon, but no one knowing exactly what those findings would reveal or how they might affect individual employees. I used this period to complete my own documentation project, ensuring that I had comprehensive records of all developments related to the investigation and Jennifer's response to external scrutiny. I maintained detailed notes about management tactics, employee reactions, and changes in workplace policies that had occurred during the investigation period. This information would be valuable for understanding how the situation had evolved and for protecting myself against potential retaliation after the investigation concluded. The final phase of preparation involved organizing my personal files and ensuring that I had copies of all important documents stored securely away from company premises. I understood that the investigation findings might prompt significant changes in company leadership and policy, and I wanted to be prepared for various possible outcomes. If the investigation vindicated my concerns, I might need documentation to support any follow-up actions or legal proceedings. If the investigation was inconclusive or favorable to management, I might need evidence to protect myself against retaliation. Most importantly, I prepared myself psychologically for the confrontation that would inevitably occur when the investigation findings were announced. Regardless of the specific conclusions reached by investigators, the process had fundamentally changed the dynamics between management and employees at Hartwell Associates. Jennifer would know that someone had provided damaging information to federal authorities, and she would likely suspect that I was involved based on my long tenure, analytical skills, and access to sensitive information. The anticipation was both stressful and energizing. After months of careful documentation and strategic patience, I was finally approaching the moment when truth would confront power directly. The investigation had provided an appropriate forum for presenting evidence of systematic management problems, and now it was time to see whether objective analysis would prevail over corporate politics and personal ambition. As September progressed and the investigation moved toward completion, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. What had begun as frustration with unfair treatment had evolved into a comprehensive documentation project that revealed serious violations of federal regulations. What had started as a personal grievance had become a matter of public interest that could affect government contracts worth millions of dollars. I had spent months learning to see beyond my immediate circumstances and understand the broader implications of Jennifer's management practices. I had developed skills in investigation and documentation that I never expected to need in a normal workplace environment. I had discovered reserves of patience and strategic thinking that allowed me to wait for the right moment rather than react emotionally to immediate provocations. Most importantly, I had learned that individual action, when properly prepared and appropriately timed, could challenge institutional power even when that power seemed overwhelming. The investigation was providing proof that one person with accurate information and sufficient determination could force accountability from management structures that had seemed invulnerable to criticism or change. The stage was set for the final confrontation between truth and power, between evidence and narrative, between accountability and impunity. Jennifer had spent months trying to control information and manage perceptions, but she was about to discover that some facts could not be spin-doctored away and some evidence could not be suppressed through intimidation or surveillance. The investigation was complete, the findings were being prepared, and justice was about to have its moment in the fluorescent-lit conference rooms and cubicle-lined hallways of Hartwell Associates. After months of careful preparation, I was ready for whatever came next. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning in late September, delivered through an urgent email marked "All Staff Meeting, Mandatory Attendance," that arrived in everyone's inbox at exactly 9:37. The timing was deliberate, interrupting the normal flow of morning work and ensuring that no one could claim scheduling conflicts or prior commitments. Within minutes, the entire office buzzed with nervous energy as employees speculated about the purpose of such an abrupt gathering. I read the email twice, noting the formal language and the unusual requirement for attendance by all personnel, including part-time workers and temporary contractors who were rarely included in company-wide meetings. The tone suggested serious business rather than routine announcements, and the short notice indicated that management wanted to control the narrative before rumors or speculation could spread beyond the office walls. As I made my way to the main conference room, I observed the faces of my colleagues and tried to gauge their expectations. Most looked anxious but curious, clearly understanding that significant news was about to be delivered but uncertain whether it would be positive or negative. A few employees who had been interviewed extensively during the federal investigation appeared particularly tense, as if they suspected their cooperation with investigators might have consequences they had not fully anticipated. The conference room had been rearranged to accommodate the entire staff, with additional chairs brought in from other areas and people standing along the walls when seating ran out. The setup felt more like a town hall meeting than a routine corporate gathering, with management arrayed at the front of the room facing rows of employees who had been given no advance information about what they were about to hear. Robert, our company president, stood at the head of the room with a stack of papers in his hand and an expression that revealed nothing about the content of his planned remarks. Beside him sat Jennifer, looking composed but slightly pale, and the company's external legal counsel, a man I recognized from previous visits but had never been formally introduced to. The presence of legal representation suggested that whatever announcement was coming had serious implications that required professional guidance. Robert began by acknowledging the disruption caused by the mandatory meeting and thanking everyone for their flexibility in attending on short notice. He explained that the company had recently completed a comprehensive review of its operations and policies, conducted in cooperation with federal regulatory agencies, and that important findings needed to be communicated to all personnel immediately. His language was careful and measured, clearly scripted to avoid unnecessary legal liability while still conveying essential information. He spoke about the company's commitment to compliance with all applicable regulations and its dedication to maintaining the highest standards of professional conduct. He emphasized that Hartwell Associates had always taken its responsibilities as a government contractor seriously and would continue to prioritize integrity and transparency in all business operations. But as Robert continued his prepared remarks, it became clear that the review had revealed significant problems that required immediate corrective action. He announced that the Department of Labor investigation had identified multiple violations of federal employment regulations and contract compliance requirements that had occurred over the previous 18 months. These violations were serious, enough to result in substantial financial penalties and the immediate suspension of several government contracts. The room remained silent as Robert detailed the specific findings that had emerged from the investigation. Systematic exclusion of qualified employees from project assignments based on age and tenure rather than performance criteria. Manipulation of vendor selection processes to benefit personal relationships rather than objective evaluation standards. Billing irregularities that had resulted in overcharges to federal agencies and potential fraud allegations. Each revelation landed like a physical blow to the assembled staff, who were hearing for the first time the extent of the problems that had been developing within their workplace. Many employees looked shocked and confused, clearly struggling to reconcile these allegations with their daily experience of routine office operations. Others appeared angry, either at the violations themselves or at the external scrutiny that was now threatening their job security. When Robert announced that Jennifer Walsh would be terminating her employment effective immediately, the silence in the room became complete and profound. No one shifted in their chairs, no one whispered to their neighbors, no one even seemed to breathe as the implications of this statement settled over the gathering. Jennifer, who had seemed untouchable just months earlier, was being removed from her position as a direct result of the federal investigation. I watched Jennifer's face as Robert delivered this announcement, looking for any sign of surprise or protest that might indicate she had not been given advance warning of this decision. But her expression remained carefully controlled, suggesting that she had been informed privately before the meeting and had time to prepare her response. She sat motionless in her chair, neither acknowledging the announcement nor attempting to defend herself against the implicit accusations. Robert continued by explaining that additional personnel changes would be implemented over the coming weeks as the company worked to address all violations identified by federal investigators. Several other managers would be reassigned or terminated, depending on their level of involvement in problematic practices. New oversight procedures would be established to prevent future violations and ensure ongoing compliance with all regulatory requirements. The financial implications of the investigation findings were substantial and immediate. The company would be required to pay significant penalties to federal agencies and might face additional civil liability depending on the outcome of ongoing legal proceedings. Several major contracts had been suspended pending resolution of compliance issues, resulting in immediate revenue losses that would affect staffing levels and operational capacity. Robert announced that approximately 30 employees would be laid off within the next 2 weeks as the company adjusted to reduced contract volume and implemented cost-cutting measures necessary to survive the financial impact of regulatory penalties. The layoffs would affect all departments and seniority levels, with decisions based primarily on the elimination of positions rather than individual performance evaluations. As he delivered this devastating news, Robert's voice remained steady and professional, but I could see the strain in his posture and the fatigue around his eyes. He was clearly struggling with the responsibility of communicating information that would fundamentally alter the lives and careers of people who had trusted the company's leadership to make sound decisions. The investigation had revealed that this trust had been violated in ways that now required painful corrective measures. When Robert opened the floor for questions, the room remained silent for several long moments. Employees seemed too stunned to formulate coherent responses to information that challenged their basic understanding of their workplace and their job security. Finally, someone from the accounting department asked about severance packages and health insurance continuation for laid-off workers. Robert provided general information about legal requirements, but acknowledged that specific details were still being finalized with legal counsel and human resources. Another employee asked about the timeline for contract reinstatement and whether the company expected to recover its previous operational levels within a reasonable period. Robert's response was cautious and non-committal, explaining that the restoration of federal contracts would depend on the company's ability to demonstrate sustained compliance with all regulatory requirements and might take many months to achieve. The most pointed question came from Michael Torres, a project manager who had worked closely with Jennifer on several of the contracts that were now under scrutiny. He asked whether employees who had followed directives from management would face personal liability for compliance violations, even if they had not been aware that those directives violated federal regulations. Robert's answer to this question was carefully worded and clearly influenced by legal counsel. He explained that the investigation had focused primarily on management-level decision-making and that individual employees who had acted in good faith, based on supervisory direction, were not expected to face personal consequences. However, he also noted that the legal situation remained fluid and that employees with specific concerns should consult with their own legal representatives. Throughout this question and answer session, Jennifer remained silent in her chair at the front of the room. She did not attempt to defend her actions, explain her decisions, or express regret for the consequences that were affecting her former colleagues. Her silence was more powerful than any statement she might have made, conveying a sense of resignation that suggested she understood the hopelessness of her situation. As the meeting drew to a close, Robert announced that individual employees would be contacted over the coming days with specific information about how the changes would affect their employment status. He encouraged everyone to continue focusing on their assigned responsibilities while the company worked through the transition process, and he emphasized that rumors and speculation would only make a difficult situation more challenging for everyone involved. When the meeting finally ended, employees filed out of the conference room in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about what they had just heard and what it might mean for their futures. The atmosphere was somber and uncertain, with people clearly struggling to process information that had fundamentally altered their understanding of their workplace and their leadership. I remained in my seat for several minutes after most employees had left, watching as Jennifer gathered her personal belongings and prepared to leave the building for the final time. She moved with quiet dignity, neither rushing to escape nor lingering to make dramatic gestures. She shook hands briefly with Robert and the legal counsel, exchanged a few words that I could not hear from my position across the room, then walked toward the exit with her head held high. As Jennifer passed my table, our eyes met for just a moment. I saw no anger in her expression, no accusation or blame, just a kind of tired recognition that the game was over and she had lost. She understood that someone had provided the information that led to her downfall, and she probably suspected that I had been involved. But there was no point in confrontation or recrimination now. The investigation had run its course. The evidence had been evaluated, and the consequences were being implemented regardless of who had initiated the process. After Jennifer left the building, I walked slowly back to my desk and sat down to consider what had just occurred. The months of careful documentation, strategic patience, and quiet cooperation with federal investigators had culminated in exactly the outcome I had hoped for. Jennifer's systematic campaign to marginalize experienced employees had been exposed and stopped. The financial irregularities and compliance violations that threatened the company's integrity had been identified and addressed. Justice had been served through proper legal channels rather than workplace confrontation or personal vendetta. But I also understood that the victory came with significant costs that extended far beyond Jennifer's termination. 30 of my colleagues would lose their jobs through no fault of their own, victims of management decisions they had not made and violations they had not committed. The company's reputation had been damaged in ways that might affect its long-term viability and competitiveness. The collaborative workplace culture that had once made Hartwell Associates a good place to work had been shattered by months of surveillance, suspicion, and fear. Over the following days, individual employees received notification about their employment status and the changes that would affect their roles within the reorganized company. I was among the employees who would retain their positions, though my responsibilities would be expanded to include compliance monitoring and oversight functions that reflected the lessons learned from the investigation. The irony was not lost on me that I was being asked to help rebuild the very systems that Jennifer's mismanagement had damaged. My experience with regulatory requirements and attention to detail, qualities that had made me a target for marginalization under Jennifer's leadership, were now viewed as essential assets for the company's recovery and future success. As the dust settled from the dramatic revelations and personnel changes, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from the kids' table at a holiday party to a position of renewed respect and responsibility within the organization. The humiliation of being treated like an irrelevant legacy employee had motivated me to document and expose systematic problems that threatened not only my own career, but the integrity of the entire company. The federal investigation had provided an appropriate forum for presenting evidence of wrongdoing, ensuring that allegations were evaluated objectively rather than dismissed through internal politics or personal relationships. The consequences that followed were proportionate to the violations that had been committed, focusing accountability on those who had made poor decisions rather than punishing innocent employees who had simply followed instructions. Most importantly, the process had demonstrated that individual action, when properly prepared and appropriately timed, could challenge institutional power even when that power seemed overwhelming. One person with accurate information and sufficient determination had been able to force accountability from management structures that had appeared invulnerable to criticism or change. The kids' table had become a vantage point for observing and documenting problems that others were too intimidated or too invested to address. The exclusion that was intended to silence and marginalize had actually created the perfect conditions for careful observation and strategic action. Jennifer's attempt to push me to the sidelines had inadvertently positioned me to see the bigger picture and take effective action when the right opportunity arose. The confrontation was over, but the real work of rebuilding and moving forward was just beginning. I had earned my seat at the grown-ups table through patience, preparation, and principled action rather than through politics or personal connections. The respect I now commanded was based on demonstrated competence and integrity rather than titles or organizational charts. As I packed up my files at the end of that transformative day, I understood that I had not only survived Jennifer's campaign against experienced employees but had played a decisive role in ending it. The documentation and evidence that had seemed like defensive measures had become offensive weapons that exposed systematic wrongdoing and forced meaningful change. The unemployment office would indeed be Jennifer's next destination, along with several of her allies who had participated in or enabled the violations that brought down her administration. But for those of us who remained, the future held the promise of a workplace where competence would be valued over politics, where experience would be respected rather than marginalized, and where integrity would guide decision-making rather than personal ambition. The long game had paid off, and justice had been served with the quiet efficiency that comes from careful preparation and strategic patience. Sometimes the best revenge is simply ensuring that the truth gets heard by the right people at the right time. The weeks following Jennifer's departure brought a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty that settled over the office like morning fog slowly clearing from the harbor. I found myself moving through familiar hallways that somehow felt different, as if the physical space itself had been transformed by the absence of the tension that had defined our workplace for so many months. Conversations flowed more naturally. Colleagues made eye contact without hesitation, and the oppressive atmosphere of surveillance and suspicion began to dissipate. My own role within the reorganized company evolved gradually but significantly. Robert approached me personally to discuss expanding my responsibilities to include oversight of compliance procedures and employee relations, acknowledging that my experience and attention to detail made me an ideal candidate for helping the company rebuild its integrity. The conversation was respectful and collaborative, a stark contrast to the dismissive interactions I had endured under Jennifer's management. The irony was not lost on me that the qualities Jennifer had viewed as liabilities, my methodical approach to problem-solving and my tendency to document everything thoroughly, were now being recognized as essential assets for the company's recovery. The institutional knowledge she had tried to marginalize was suddenly valuable again, and my long tenure was seen as a source of stability rather than an obstacle to progress. Over the course of several weeks, I worked closely with external consultants, and legal advisors to develop new policies and procedures that would prevent the kind of systematic violations that had led to the federal investigation. The work was challenging and meaningful, requiring me to analyze complex regulatory requirements and translate them into practical guidelines that employees at all levels could understand and implement effectively. The process of rebuilding also involved difficult conversations with colleagues who had been affected by the layoffs and reorganization. Some employees felt betrayed by the company's leadership and chose to seek employment elsewhere, even if their positions had been preserved. Others struggled with feelings of guilt about surviving cuts that had affected friends and longtime coworkers. The healing process would take time, but there was a sense that the company was finally moving in a positive direction. One morning, in late October, I received an unexpected phone call from Patricia Chen at the Department of Labor. She informed me that the investigation had been officially closed and that all recommended corrective actions had been successfully implemented by Hartwell Associates. The company had paid the required penalties, established new compliance procedures, and demonstrated a commitment to preventing future violations. Patricia also shared that Jennifer Walsh and 2 other former managers were facing personal civil penalties for their role in the violations, and that criminal charges were being considered by federal prosecutors. The investigation had revealed that the problems at our company were part of a broader pattern of misconduct that had affected multiple government contractors, and Jennifer's actions had contributed to systemic fraud that cost taxpayers significant amounts of money. The news that Jennifer would face personal consequences for her actions provided a sense of closure that I had not expected to feel. I had never sought revenge or punishment for its own sake, but there was something satisfying about knowing that accountability extended beyond simple termination of employment. The violations had been serious enough to warrant ongoing legal action, confirming that my decision to document and report the problems had been both necessary and appropriate. As autumn progressed into winter, the office culture continued to improve in ways both subtle and obvious. Robert implemented new communication policies that encouraged transparency and employee input on important decisions. Regular town hall meetings were scheduled to ensure that information flowed freely throughout the organization. Performance evaluations were restructured to focus on actual contributions and achievements rather than subjective assessments of loyalty or attitude. Most importantly, experience and expertise were once again valued and utilized effectively. Senior employees who had been marginalized under Jennifer's leadership found themselves back in meaningful roles where their knowledge could benefit the entire organization. Collaborative projects replaced competitive environments, and the artificial hierarchies that had created division and resentment were gradually dismantled. The holiday party that December was a deliberate contrast to the previous year's elaborate and exclusionary event. Instead of an expensive hotel ballroom with assigned seating, the celebration was held in our own conference room with a potluck dinner and informal atmosphere. Everyone was invited, everyone was welcome, and everyone was treated with equal respect regardless of their position or tenure. I sat wherever I chose that evening, surrounded by colleagues who had become genuine friends rather than simply coworkers, navigating a hostile environment. We talked about our families, our hobbies, our hopes for the coming year, and our shared commitment to rebuilding the collaborative culture that had once made Hartwell Associates a good place to work. There were no kids' tables, no carefully orchestrated networking opportunities, no performances of corporate hierarchy. During the informal remarks portion of the evening, Robert acknowledged the difficult year the company had endured and thanked everyone for their patience and dedication during the transition period. He spoke specifically about the value of employee feedback and the importance of maintaining ethical standards in all business operations. While he did not mention the investigation directly, his comments made clear that the lessons learned would guide future decision-making. Several colleagues approached me throughout the evening to express appreciation for my role in exposing the problems that had threatened the company's integrity. They understood, without needing explicit confirmation, that my documentation and Cooperation with investigators had been essential to addressing the systematic violations. The gratitude was quiet and genuine, reflecting an understanding that speaking up had required courage and carried personal risks. As I drove home that night through the familiar streets of Baltimore, I reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the past year. What had begun as personal frustration with unfair treatment had evolved into a comprehensive effort to protect not only my own interests, but the integrity of an organization that employed hundreds of people and served important public purposes. The documentation project that had started as a defensive measure had become an offensive weapon that exposed serious wrongdoing and forced meaningful change. The patience and strategic thinking that had sustained me through months of marginalization and humiliation had ultimately proven more effective than immediate confrontation or emotional protest. Most importantly, I had learned that individual action, when properly prepared and appropriately timed, could challenge institutional power even when that power seemed overwhelming. One person with accurate information and sufficient determination had been able to force accountability from management structures that had appeared invulnerable to criticism or change. The months that followed brought continued improvement in workplace culture and operational effectiveness. New contracts were gradually restored as the company demonstrated sustained compliance with regulatory requirements. Employee morale improved steadily as people regained confidence in leadership and felt valued for their contributions. The collaborative environment that had once characterized Hartwell Associates was successfully rebuilt on a stronger foundation. My own career flourished in ways I had not anticipated when I first began documenting Jennifer's problematic practices. The compliance oversight role evolved into a broader position involving strategic planning and organizational development. My experience with regulatory requirements and attention to detail made me an invaluable resource for preventing future problems and ensuring continued success. But perhaps most satisfying was the restoration of respect and recognition that had been absent during Jennifer's tenure. My opinions were sought and valued, my expertise was utilized effectively, and my long service to the company was viewed as an asset rather than a liability. The marginalization and exclusion that had once defined my workplace experience had been replaced by meaningful participation and genuine collaboration. The legal proceedings against Jennifer and her associates continued for several more months, ultimately resulting in significant financial penalties and permanent exclusion from government contracting work. While I took no personal satisfaction in her misfortune, the outcomes confirmed that the violations had been serious and that accountability was appropriate and necessary. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that the kids' table had indeed been a vantage point for observing and understanding problems that others were too intimidated or too invested to address. The exclusion that was intended to silence and marginalize had actually created perfect conditions for careful observation and strategic action. Jennifer's attempt to push experienced employees to the sidelines had inadvertently positioned us to see the bigger picture and take effective action when the right opportunity arose. The humiliation of being treated as irrelevant had motivated comprehensive documentation that ultimately exposed systematic wrongdoing and forced meaningful change. The unemployment office had indeed become Jennifer's destination, along with several allies who had participated in or enabled the violations that brought down her administration. But for those of us who remained, the future held promise of a workplace where competence would be valued over politics, where experience would be respected rather than marginalized, and where integrity would guide decision-making rather than personal ambition. The long game had paid off completely. Justice had been served with quiet efficiency that comes from careful preparation and strategic patience. Sometimes the most effective response to injustice is not immediate confrontation, but methodical documentation and professional action through appropriate channels. As I settled into my expanded role and continued contributing to the company's recovery and growth, I understood that I had not only survived Jennifer's campaign against experienced employees, but had played the decisive role in ending it. The Truth had been heard by the right people at the right time, and the consequences had been both appropriate and effective. The kids' table had become a launching pad for meaningful change, proving that sometimes the person sitting in the corner has been paying closer attention than anyone realized. Power built on manipulation and intimidation had crumbled when confronted with careful documentation and patient determination. The story was complete, the justice was served, and the future was bright with possibilities that came from standing up for what was right when it mattered most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.